Good morning, you're watching Sky News Breakfast. Our top stories. The next stage is coming. Israel's Prime Minister tells his soldiers to get ready as the IDF says it will attack Gaza by land, air and sea. Desperate scenes in northern Gaza as thousands flee, but many more stay put as Israel rejects claims it's targeted evacuation convoys. British nationals in Gaza told to head to the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, but there's more confusion over who will be allowed through and when. Total chaos. We speak to a British-Israeli soldier who was one of the first to engage Hamas fighters during last weekend's attack. And Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer send fresh messages of support to Israel hours after a pro-Palestinian march in London. Poland goes to the polls in what's being called the most important elections since the fall of communism. And Ring of Fire stargazers in the Americas are treated to an annular solar eclipse. Well, in a moment, we'll discuss the papers with communications expert Zaki Cooper and broadcaster Afia Hagen. But first, let's take you through the front pages of the Sunday papers. Escape to hell. That headline from the Daily Mirror as it details the situation in Gaza. The Observer looks at Israel's warning to those fleeing Gaza as they say the next stage is coming. The Sunday Telegraph is also leading with Israel's ground operation in Gaza, as is the Sunday Times. The Sunday Express headlines the Prime Minister's words, "We stand by Israel always," and reports on the former Labour leader, joining thousands in supporting Palestinians in today's march. The Mail on Sunday focuses on today's London march, picturing two women parading with pictures of paragliders used by Hamas. I think that should have said yesterday's march. And with us this morning to review the papers is communications expert Zaki Cooper and broadcaster Afia Hagen. Good to see you both. Thanks so much for joining us. Certainly only one story in town, understandably, all the front pages leading with the dire situation in the Middle East. Afia, let's talk about the front page of the Observer first. That horrendous picture of a little girl in Gaza being carried by a member of the emergency services.
Yeah, I mean, it's on all the front pages, like we said. This picture, particularly hard to look at. There's actually the story in the sidebar that really got me this morning. So this is, my mother sacrificed her life to save me from Hamas killer. So this was a 16-year-old boy called Rotem. He was inside their safe room, heard shooting just outside the door, and the gunman managed to break through the door and shot his mother and father, and they actually used themselves as a human shield. And he lay there for several hours with the body of his mother over the top of him, covered in her blood and his blood, injured, texting his family to a WhatsApp group, begging them for help. At first they thought perhaps that he was joking. It took several hours for him to be rescued. And that just shows it's just one story out of thousands literally, of how families are being torn apart. And I think at the centre of this, when you strip away all the use of language, all the politics, that there's so much human tragedy and human suffering on both sides, and it's horrendous.
Yeah, certainly there's a real sense of hopelessness when you read some of these stories, isn't there? That's how I felt this week, Zaki. As Afia just said there, on the front page of the Observer, you know, you've got a photo of a Palestinian girl suffering there, and of course the terrible situation in Gaza, and then yet more terrible stories about what civilians went through in Israel a week ago. And certainly the politics, you almost want the politics and the shouting to just stop and focus on this horrendous human suffering that we're seeing on both sides.
Terrible human suffering. I mean, we've heard so many stories, more in a way than we can cope with, unimaginable horrors. Obviously, the Hamas attack on Israel last Saturday, more Jewish people killed in any single day than since the Holocaust. So terrible sort of memories, terrible sort of harking back to tragedy in Jewish history. So, yes, at the heart of this is human suffering, absolutely. And on the front page of the Sunday Express, we have a story about the Prime Minister saying that he will stand by Israel always, because unfortunately we do have politics here, and the British government has been very steadfast in its support for Israel, both in terms of its words, but also offering military support. And also mindful of the harmful effect on the Jewish community here. We've seen extra security, we've seen increased attacks on Jews online and in person, we've seen certain Jewish schools close on Friday as well. So really distressing situation, which has had knock-on effects here, obviously.
And may I say, thoroughly depressing in the UK in 2023 to see this rise in anti-Semitism and these terrible anecdotes that we're hearing about of Jewish school children not going to school and not feeling safe wearing their uniforms. Afia, front page of the Sunday Telegraph, like all the others, also focusing on this story, and of course, crucially, what happens next with this ground invasion expected imminently in Gaza.
Yes, Israel set to hit Hamas from land, sea, and air. Preparing for this huge assault, with a ground invasion, you think, personally, I think it's only going to get worse, right? We're going to see even worse pictures. We're going to see even more stories of human suffering. And I think also, you're going to have that hand-to-hand combat using sort of back streets and all the inroads and things like that. And it's about Israel trying to destroy the capabilities and the infrastructure of Hamas in this situation, but also you cannot help but think you're going to have so many civilians, innocent Palestinian civilians, caught up in this. 1 million people told to head south, but there's no actual safe routes for them to get there. We saw on Friday the bombing of that convoy of 70 people on a thoroughfare, a really busy Israeli street a really busy street in Gaza that they were told was safe just an hour beforehand. And so if you have 1 million people in that part of Gaza where they're aiming to attack, what's going to happen to them? If there's no safe routes for them to leave, what is going to happen to them? That's my real concern here.
And Zaki, just before we move on, let's just talk about this ground invasion. Israel clearly wants to restore its own security. It wants to retaliate against Hamas. Almost everything else seems secondary.
Yes.
But we've seen this enormous evacuation order, which has been in place for the last couple of days, including 22 hospitals in northern Gaza, which is just not practical, realistic, or humane, is it, to expect them to evacuate?
Well, it's a very difficult situation, and there is a humanitarian situation there which we cannot turn our hearts away from. Israel's fight is not with the Palestinian people, it's with Hamas. And any country that had been attacked by terrorists would have to take action against those terrorists. If Britain had had a group of terrorists coming over from continental Europe, its population would expect the government and the military to take action against what had happened. And Israel's in an impossible situation. It has not sought this war, it does not want this war, but it has to do something to take out Hamas. And a lot of the military experts, and it comes across in today's papers, have said, look, it's not, obviously, it's suboptimal, it's not ideal, no one wants war, no innocent person should be killed, but Israel does not have a choice other than to take action against Hamas that's butchered over 1,000 of its own people.
Yeah, but of course there will be lots of people on the other side who would argue that Israel could be handling this differently. Afia and Zaki, I'd like to talk to you both about this march that we saw in London yesterday, and a huge turnout, around 5,000 people, if I'm not mistaken, the Mail leading on this story. It passed largely peacefully. It was peaceful.
Yeah.
Very, very few arrests, but the Mail Afia leading with this photo of two supporters who turned out to support Palestine, with photographs of what seems to be paragliders on their backs.
And the thing is that it's very disappointing, actually, that has happened, that people are out supporting Palestine, but using that as an opportunity to also support Hamas. What we must realise and always make the distinction that every single Palestinian person is not Hamas at all. And like you so rightly said, Zaki, Israel's fight is not with Palestinian people, it's with Hamas. And, you know, we can support the Palestinian people, we can support them and their side in this fight without being anti-Semitic and without supporting Hamas.
Yeah,
and that's really important.
Yeah, and the Metropolitan Police did say that they were going to arrest anyone who was openly supporting Hamas at yesterday's march. And the reference here with these two photographs, these two images on these women's backs of the paraglide is thought to be the association with last weekend's attacks where Hamas fighters paraglided into Israel. Zaki, of course, you are a member of the Jewish community here in the UK. What's the feeling and what's the last week been like for you?
Yeah, look, the feeling is of acute anxiety. It's also of grief and mourning and shock. It's of a sense that Israel is a haven for Jewish people and it's under attack. And we thought it was a secure state. It's had to build a security barrier around its perimeter precisely to safeguard against these sorts of terrorist attacks. And we've had a breach of that. So it's been sort of profound shock, grief. There's a lot of there's barely a Jewish family in the UK who doesn't have family and friends in Israel. And many people know people who have been serving in the Israel Defense Forces, who have been called up as reservists. So yeah, there's a lot of connectedness, but there's also a sense of, humanity. We don't want innocent people to die, absolutely not. But what Hamas did last weekend was the height of evil, and to ask Israel to sit back and do nothing does not seem a viable option. So there's a huge amount of support for Israel taking action against Hamas.
Okay, and just briefly, Afia, before we end this section of the papers, let's just talk about the front page of the Mirror briefly, which is very stark in its image today when it reports on the situation in Gaza.
Absolutely, and some, again, another absolutely shocking, such a shocking image. And like I say, as we prepare for an attack by land, sea and air, we're only going to see more of these particularly shocking images. And also, these images are so emotive that it gives it so much of a rise in feeling. And like you said, it's so depressing that in 2023 we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. It's what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening with Israel and Palestine, it should not give birth to these feelings of people being scared to walk around with wearing a Star of David or, wearing cultural clothes people shouldn't be afraid to be Jewish walking around in London, to be Palestinian walking around in London or anywhere. It should just not be like that. But images like this are so emotive that it will promote this kind of, anger and shock in people and looking at either side wanting to take a side, but there's two sides here. There's two sides to every story, and there's suffering on both sides.
Afia, Zaki, we'll have to leave it there. We'll see you both again next hour. Thank you both so much.